start pretty much now, as I think more people are going to start coming through, but I don't want to hold up, delay things too much. Hopefully everybody's seen, obviously, what this session's about from the promotional copy, which we uploaded. Thank you to the RCA for arranging this and promoting it. And thank you to Jeremy for joining us. Jeremy Wilks is a science journalist and presenter at the international broadcaster Euronews. He presents on TV as well as on their recently launched Ocean Calls podcast. So I thought it would be a brilliant guest to have with us as we count down to COP27. Must be about 50 days away, I guess. So we're going to hear from Jeremy about what he's got planned, what the channel is perhaps doing around COP and the build up to and through. But really, Jeremy's here to share his thoughts on what brand communicators are getting right, what they're getting wrong, what kind of content and stories he and his colleagues like, want more of, want less of, and basically share some insights and some experience which should help, I think, all of us perhaps refine our stories or our pitching, but to make everybody's lives better. So yeah, we're going to launch into it pretty quickly, Jeremy, if that's okay. I've given a very, very brief intro to you and the channel there. Can you tell us a bit more about Euronews and maybe what a typical day or a typical week involves for you?
Explaining Euronews is very difficult because we're actually a huge machine these days. We broadcast in 9 languages to 160 countries around the world. That's the figure I give. It changes all of the time, but 9 languages is where we are at the moment. But we also have affiliate versions of Euronews which broadcast in other languages, which you can add on to that. So we have Euronews Georgia, Euronews Albania, Romania. I'm not going to be able to list all of them now, but that's one of the ways that we've expanded the channel. We also own African News, which is an entirely different channel that comes under our umbrella, literally because they're in our building, but editorially they do their own thing. They use some of our material, we use some of theirs, but they're a separate operation to us. And we obviously have changed ownership as well quite recently. For those who've been following these things, we started out back in 1994. Goodness knows who owned us then. When I moved, though, it was majority ownership was ITN. Then we went through a period more recently of being owned by an Egyptian billionaire. We were also invested in heavily by NBC for a while until they set off to go and make a news channel that never happened. That was a reworking of Sky News International. And now we are currently owned by a Portuguese investment fund who have had that purchase validated quite recently. And the boss that we now have is actually the former editorial head at BFM TV in France, which is a very kind of live news kind of channel, a little bit like Sky. In terms of what I do, I make Climate Now, which is a monthly program giving data on climate change. That is a sponsored program, sponsored by the Copernicus Climate Change Service. And I also make Ocean Calls, as you mentioned, a new podcast series, which is a new thing for me, making a podcast. And that is financed by the Directorate General DG Mare, so the Fisheries Directorate of the European Commission. We work with the European Commission on various programs. I'm also the executive producer on a series called Real Economy that talks about the real economy, and that one is supported by DG ECFIN and DG Employ. So we have financing from different places. Some of the other programs have wholly commercial sponsors like Rolex, and some of the others are governments and so all kinds of different sponsors and things. But I work in the sponsored magazines department, mostly on European related magazines. Yeah.
Great stuff. Really useful summary there. And in terms of the kind of content that you put out, can you give us a bit of a snapshot of that, whether that's TV or via the podcast?
So on
TV, if there's any brand stories that you featured that really kind of caught your eye or piqued your interest recently, I think that might be useful for our viewers.
Yeah, we sometimes brands get lucky with us in the sense that we might be making a program about a particular topic, and it is a brand, a company that's prepared to open its doors and let us in and let us film their premises, and that illustrates what we're aiming to do, and it scratches their back and scratches mine. We have done that with the wind industry, who I found from a PR perspective to be some of the best. They're really head and shoulders above most other sectors, actually, the wind industry in Europe. I was just filming in Germany with a container company that had trouble with the low water on the Rhine, and it's a company called Contargo. Most of the companies there said no, very straight no. We have tons of requests from journalists. We don't want to talk to you. Maybe they don't want to show that they can't quite do the job that they would like to do. But Contargo said, no, we can spin this in our direction a little bit. Will you interview our sustainability manager? And I asked them, okay, well, what's she going to say? Is that going to fit my story or not? And they ended up, having two of their people in our story. So brands can get access into our programs. We won't necessarily have programs which are entirely people from one company, but sometimes you end up that it's pretty much the case. You might have one academic or an analyst, and then a load of people from one company. The Real Economy show that I oversee, it's very much the case. We needed to do a show last year that was related to supporting. Now, what was it to do? It was to do with bringing companies back into Europe in terms of production. That was the goal of the program, was to say companies are bringing their manufacturing back to Europe from Asia. I happen to know the bicycle industry had been doing that because I'm a keen cyclist, and also because I've been talking to them. And so I put them on the case there. And we did a really nice feature with the bicycle industry who opened up the doors and let us film in their factory. And again, filming in people's factories isn't very easy, but if they'll open the door and let us do it, that's great.
It sounds like it was interesting you mentioned that there was one organization that wouldn't let you film, and that kind of, I guess, your greenwashing radar started beeping, or whatever the metaphor is that I should use properly. I mean, is that one of the big tells for you, that if you do request that kind of access and you get a hard no, then it probably means they're trying to tell a story which might not be fully backed up by practice? Or is that fair to say that? And if it's not that, what are the tells?
I think that it is, in lots of cases, it's that they are nervous about what we're going to say because they've had bad experiences with local or national media. And we are coming to them with a different kind of point of view and a different reputation, I think. And sometimes it's because they've had bad experiences. And sometimes it's because they're sensitive about what they're doing because they don't think it looks very good. And what I think they don't understand is that what we want is truth, and we don't mind if something's not fixed. Do you know what I mean? Or that they haven't got a perfect version of whatever it is they're talking about, because we like showing process and somebody doing something. I mean, I make a lot of science programs, and a lot of the science programs I make don't show answers. They show, well, we're working on this, and here's what we're developing. Years ago, I went filming with Lotus. I don't know how many owners ago that was, but they were very happy to let us in and show us prototypes and show us their process and how they're trying to, for example, make parts of the car from hemp, I think it was, and trying to make kind of plastic type materials. And it wasn't working very well, but it was kind of, they were trying to work on it and trying to show us what they were doing. We like that. And I think the audience likes that too, because they go, look, these guys are being upfront. They're saying, here's our problems, and here's what we're trying to get to. And you kind of go, well, everybody's like that, aren't they? So, and I know greenwashing tends to be more in PR communications to me, where they're trying to sell me something, and then I think, I'm not sure how significant this is, or you're overselling, or you're overstepping the boundaries in terms of what it is that you can really deliver with whatever it is that you're trying to sell me. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. Made a note of that in terms of, you like companies that are sharing their challenges, sharing the solutions they're trying, but also not being too bullish and necessarily saying we've solved this.
No, and I think the other door, I mean, another one, and an interesting one on this one is one, they can offer us a unique opportunity. So if a space industry organization says, we would like you to come and watch our launch, and nobody else is coming to see it, then we'll get pretty excited about that. And we might even go spend some money and go. So I suppose that those are times when you feel excited about what a company is offering you. But I think when it comes to their communication to us, I think the big message from me is don't oversell. You're not going to fix climate change with a couple of organic yogurts. Do you know what I mean? And so don't try and tell me that you're going to, because I know you're not going to.
That's interesting. So does that again nod to some of your frustrations where you feel that some people almost present an overconfidence in terms of a solution or overplay their hand, whereas we should all, as brand communicators, yes, of course, be proud of what steps we're taking as brands, but realize we're part of a much broader solution? Yeah,
and I hear a lot of, when we're talking about climate change, and I'll tell you about climate change related communication that I get, I hear about fighting or battling or overcoming climate change. And that seems to be the completely wrong language in lots of ways. Number one, a kind of fighting or battling suggests a short period of conflict and then a winner, which you won't have with climate change. And I think that it also has this kind of opposition language to it, which isn't correct either, because in fact, the reality is we need to move with and adapt with climate change. It's going to happen, whatever you do. Even if we all stopped now and CO2 emissions ceased this minute, then sea level would continue to rise. The inertia in the system means that temperatures would go up for the next 30 odd years, which is the lifetime that a lot of people can see ahead of them. So that kind of language of, and it's not just brands as well. I mean, politicians will use this language. Some campaign groups on the environmental side will use this kind of language. And it's easy to fall into that trap of copying what everybody else is saying. But, what you should be thinking is, what are we doing to limit further warming? And when you look at who talks about this well, it's a pretty short list of organizations, I think, that talk about this in language which is accurate related to the climate science. In fact, the one campaigner I'd say is completely on the ball on this is Greta Thunberg, because if you read her speeches, and it's probably best to read her speeches rather than listening to them, because you'll really get what she's saying in your head rather than being swept up in the fun of watching it. She's totally right all of the time, and she's always saying, listen to the science, and she's completely on the ball. But I hear a lot of crap, to be honest, from politicians and sometimes from campaigners as well. But I also hear it from brands. And I think that, who's doing it well, if you look at, I think the space agencies talk about it well, the European Space Agency, NASA talk about climate change well, the big meteorological organizations, things like World Meteorological Organization, Copernicus talk about it well, because of course it's their bread and butter, it's their climate scientists. But there's an awful lot of overselling or kind of getting distracted in details. And then, in fact, the impact you're going to have is very minimal. Yeah,
that's interesting. The question about that, I think well, first of all, it's the first time anybody will run a broadcast PRCA event and be told, read it, don't watch it or hear it. So thank you for your candor there. But
there's a book
I know exactly what you mean.
There's a book of Greta speeches. There's a little book, and it's really good because you realise.
I get it. I completely get it. I think I have a question though about that realism, and I think a lot of people are still coming to terms with the fact that, again, any major change now may not prove beneficial for a generation or two. And I heard you being very vocal about that during the heat wave, where there was this kind of hopeful line of questioning from a lot of people, be it presenters on your own channel to the wider media, about, well, what do we do to stop having 40-degree summers? It's like, we're kind of a bit too late for that now, but we can stop maybe it being worse and being 50-degree summers. I guess my question would be then, how do you tread, we know how influential broadcast media can be. I think on your podcast recently, you had the writer and director of March of the Penguins, which when it came out nearly 20 years ago, really impactful film, documentary, which again, made people think about their own actions and wildlife and the world in a different way. We've seen other films, documentaries. Okja affected a lot of people in terms of their meat consumption. A lot of documentaries have done similarly, as do TV and radio news programming. How do you strike that balance though between cutting through with the realism and making sure you don't tip so far that you introduce an element of fatalism amongst your audience? Because ultimately what we all want to do is inspire positive behavioural change, but it's difficult, I think, to find that Goldilocks period where you're not so bleak that people just switch off, but you're not so optimistic that people think we're going to be fine if we don't act.
Yeah, or that you come across as slightly ridiculous. I often think that, in fact, you've got to be narrow about what it is you're saying you're going to do. And I think, so if a brand is doing that, for example, take an airline. We know that they're going to carry on polluting, and they can't convince us they're not going to for the foreseeable future. But if they were to announce that they were going to be eliminating waste from flights, and they're going to be recycling everything, and they were going to get an independent organization in to check to make sure that all of that stuff that you get served when you're on the plane on transatlantic flight does end up in the correct place and gets dealt with properly. If that kind of story is narrow, you say this is our objective and we're going to achieve it, then I think you get a lot of traction. If you did that and then you said we're going to fix climate change by doing this, I think a lot of people would kind of go, well, no, you're not. You're not at all, not in any way. So don't try and sell me that line, because I'm just going to, be cynical about it. But I think when it comes to other kinds of messaging, and I don't think that you're representing any politicians, but if anybody here is, then I think politicians need to also kind of avoid shrill language and actually be kind of educational and say, this is a thing that we understand, this is a thing that we are trying to fix, is perhaps a better way of looking at a problem and narrowing it down. I don't want people to be fatalistic, but I think people have to be accept that far too much of the conversation at the moment, and it was the case at Glasgow and it was the case at the other COPs as well, was about mitigation. So it's about energy, basically. It's about reducing your CO2 emissions. Not enough of the conversations that I get from PRs, that I get from campaigners, and that I get from politicians as well. Not enough of those are about adaptation. And adaptation isn't as exciting because you don't get a cool new geothermal power plant or some crazy biofuels or whatever, or nice established things like solar panels or whatever. But adaptation is sort of what we need to be really thinking about, because the warming that we've got now is severe and extreme, and it's not going to get any better. And that's another thing about the language of the sort of fight of this idea that we could go back to where we were. We're not going to go back to where we were. Whatever happens, we're not going to go back to where we were. Another top fact, though, that I have to tell you to get across, this is a really good one, because and I always tell people that, like PRs and things who talk to me, say, read the IPCC reports, the short version. The long one's horrible to read, but just read the short one. The executive summary, just have a look at that. But here's a good one. I mean, I often get things telling me about sustainable transport solutions, how marvelous they are. If you were to implement all of these marvelous sustainable transport, zero emission things, and you actually took the air pollution out of the atmosphere, the result is, in fact, that warming would increase. It's in the IPCC reports, because all of that particle pollution that we've got from all of these emissions actually reflects sunlight back out of the atmosphere. So it's calculated it would be between half a degree and 1 degree of warming would happen within about 2 years if you cut all of the pollution, the air pollution, that we all complain about. I'm not saying that we shouldn't cut all of the air pollution, because it's horrible. And you see it sitting there, don't you, over a city. And I'm lucky to live in the countryside, but it still happens here. But, if people had read the IPCC reports, then they probably wouldn't write to me with these over-optimistic copy, telling me about all these marvelous things that are going to happen, how we're going to fix global warming by having an electric scooter, because we're not.
I think that's a great shout. I think that links back to what you were saying earlier about focus on the positives you are confident you can commit to, but don't necessarily position it as the solution necessarily. I think that's a great reminder. Thinking about that point you made about adaptation, which is more of a kind of very much a future gazing piece. Is that one of the stories which is maybe harder to tell on TV because there aren't many visuals to show it yet, because it's something we're looking to do in the future, and maybe easier to do on the podcast? And if not, can you tell me a bit about, obviously, the podcast which launched recently? How does that format enable you to tell a story in a different way, beyond the obvious of the fact you don't need visuals necessarily to bring it to life, which you do need for telling?
Two questions there. I think on adaptation, actually, I think adaptation can work quite well on TV. If we've, let's say, the second story that we made for the Climate Now series, the first story we made was a very depressing one about melting glaciers, and it was just miserable. It was miserable to be there, so everybody should go and listen to a melting glacier, and it hits home pretty hard. The second story that we did was about dealing with sea level rise in Rotterdam. Rotterdam are really on the case when it comes to PR. They've got a person whose job it is to get international media to report on how cool Rotterdam is. I mean, that is just pretty impressive, isn't it? And she's really, really reactive and excellent. And she's got tons of ideas. And she'll say to you, well, I've got all of this lot different, I've got my floating dairy farm. I've got my, water capture areas. I've got rooftop gardens dealing with heat. What would you like to film? And you think, great. And so actually adaptation can work quite well, but sometimes it is a story of like questions of there isn't a positive outcome. I did a story in France this year about the mayors in communes on the western coast of France who now have to face up to sea level rise, and they're going to have to change their planning rules. And they just don't really quite know what they're going to have to do. And it's a story about that. So it's an adaptation story, but it was one that was very open-ended. Coming to the podcast and what kinds of guests you put on a podcast, that's really different to the guests you put onto a TV show. It's actually really, really different. And that's been interesting because you would actually aim for generalists, analysts, people who've got a big overview for a podcast in a way that you wouldn't for a TV show. In a TV show, you're always looking for witnesses. And the best way to illustrate this is sit down and watch the news when there's been a bit of a disaster somewhere with your relatives, and they will talk to each other when the journalist is talking, and they will go, oh, look at that, and comment on it. But when the person whose house has been hit by flooding talks, everybody listens. And so TV is always about trying to get that witness voice of like, here's the user, here's the person who's lived it, whatever, and then here's the expert. But really it's that. Podcast, it isn't the same thing at all. I want to have people who are well-known in their field, who've got a high-level view. We just did an episode about illegal and unregulated fishing, and I got the two guys that pretty much every expert that I spoke to said, you need to get these people. They're really good. And they know what they're talking about, and they've written a book about it, or they've written the book about it, maybe. So the podcast is different in that sense. And I think the other thing that's different when we're recording the podcast is that we are actually then, once we've got these top experts, we try to encourage them to show their human side, to come out with anecdotes. For example, we just did an episode about marine plastic pollution, which is pretty depressing and super interesting at the same time. Because again, it's a problem that won't go away. It's not fixable. No ocean clear up's going to do it. Sorry, an ocean clear up, they do a good job on PR. It looks great, but no, it's not going to fix it. And there, to start that story in the podcast, I asked the two guests to tell me about their experiences of ocean plastic. One of them, she lives near Plymouth, was telling me about going out swimming and seeing plastic there every day when she goes swimming. The other guy lives in Tahiti, and he told me a story about diving deep in the Mediterranean 20 years ago and seeing bottles of stuff that was not decomposing in the dark depths of the ocean. And those kinds of things actually hook people into a podcast and say, okay, this is an expert person, but it's also a normal person. Yeah. And so I can relate to that, not because I've done it, but it sounds like they describe something real, and then you get into the discussion. So we've actually been working with an agency called Ocenta, based in Paris, run by an mostly American team, actually, who've been helping us on podcast structure and content and what it really is to do a podcast. And it's totally different, actually. The narration is really quite different. And it's a lot more cozy, and you're looking for anecdotes and moments of reaction and things. And I wouldn't use anecdotes in a TV program unless they were particularly pithy and lasted 20 seconds. And most of the time they don't,
Well, that makes a lot of sense. That longer form content offering, I like the tip about humanizing the guests straight away, and then you're into the kind of expertise, so they become relatable as opposed to just a leader in their field. Just as well, a reminder for anybody watching, we're going to have a little Q&A session shortly. So if you do have any questions for Jeremy, please feel free to pop them in the chat, and I'll do my best to put those to Jeremy if we have time. Before we get to that though, Jeremy, obviously COP27 is fast approaching. You've mentioned it, I've mentioned it. How are Euronews planning on covering it? Are you going to be there?
Yes, I'm going to be there.
And any tips for for anybody that might still have an opportunity to get involved, I guess, with your output?
I think it'll be across everything. I'm specifically going there to make a Climate Now episode and to do some moderation with the European Commission on one of their stands. I think I might be doing some news coverage from there. Normally ends up that I'm going for one reason and then news phone me up for some other reason. We will have somebody from Euronews Green going there as well, and her job will be to write stories for Euronews Green, which is our online kind of vertical, we call it. I think that's the proper term for these things. So she'll be writing articles, probably doing some video as well. And her team also, who are based all around Europe, will be writing content. That is probably an area where brands can probably get some traction because, announcements that are weighty, my example of the, airline that's going to clear up all of its rubbish sort of thing, that we feel are significant and would relate to audiences who are interested in travel, interested in green, interested in future technology. Those will be, that's a good time to kind of pitch those stories. I think a lot of it will be, pitch it during the week or so beforehand or the 2 weeks beforehand, and then hopefully try and get some traction for those 2 crazy weeks of COP. I would say when it comes to that, the really useful thing for us is when the PR phones us, or which they seldom do, but that's a different point, but they send us a message. It's really good if they know our content and they say, I know you've got this future thinkers video series that you're doing and I've seen them. Our guy is really interesting about education and climate change. Why don't you think about having him on that program? Do you know what I mean? Because that really
that's so often one of the first tips that anybody gives is watch our output. Understand it first of all. Because,
and the other tip is actually phone us up, because a lot of you probably think that I don't get phoned up, but I do get phoned up all the time. But in fact, the reality is I don't get phoned up that much. And marketeers are actually very good at this, and British PRs are particularly good at this. So I'm not aiming to flatter you too much. I'm just saying this, relating a comment that came through for one of my Italian colleagues who went, British PRs are just so much better than all the others because they're not as hardcore and tough as the American ones, but they do actually pick up the phone. And I think picking up the phone and telling us stuff is actually useful. Getting back to COP coverage, so it'll be across the board. I mean, news will be talking about whatever's happening with carbon trading, or whoever's pledged whatever amount of money to help poorer countries and adaptation or whatever. I'll be making a program content-wise to be decided, possibly talking about the early warning systems, which I think is quite an interesting line that's going to come from this. Possibly talking about tipping points. If I can get somebody good to talk about that, I don't know yet. But that's one of the things I've been doing today. One of the things I'd say that overall, another kind of message for this audience is, in fact, it's really hard for us to get high-level CEOs, like bosses of big companies, are really hard for us to get, and push those forward, because we will say yes to those people, and it's a challenge, constantly to try and get high-level business people to talk about things, and they're so kind of keen on their messaging that you never feel that they're ever being genuine. But we really need them to kind of come and talk honestly about the problems they've got.
Good advice. And I guess maybe a technical question as well to kind of layer on top of that, thinking again, probably about the TV output as opposed to green or ocean calls. But how do you favour taking an interview? Obviously, the last few years, we saw everyone go remote through necessity. We're finding at Marketeers that a lot of people now, certainly on the radio side, are insisting upon ISDN sound quality again, certainly for the BBCs who have just committed to using ISDN for longer than anticipated. On TV, it's a real mixture. We find people are, again, depending upon the quality of the guest and the story, Zoom might be acceptable, Skype might be acceptable. Others are saying they've got to be in studio or got to be via uplink. What's your policy at the moment? And I guess, does it depend upon the quality of the guest and kind of where they are?
Our overall idea would be, but for news, reactivity is the most important thing. And so if we get the person via Skype, Zoom, whatever video conferencing system, that's totally fine if they are quick, because we want them to be quick if it's news. When I'm making magazines programs, I will go and see them, or if we can't go and see them in some of the other programs, we will send a crew to film them. On the Real Economy series, we did kind of fake Skype chats where we actually sent a crew to go and film with the person. We the presenter connected via a phone, answered all of the questions. We recorded the answers looking straight at the camera, and then we cut those afterwards with the presenter sitting in a park somewhere, asking the questions and nodding their head. So it does depend on the guests. If you're doing one of our global conversation series, which is where we interview like heads of state or really high level people, we would pretty much insist on doing that face to face with a three camera shoot. So it does depend. We're pretty flexible, actually. Well, I don't think that we've necessarily got any hard and fast rules. When it comes to audio on the podcast, it is hilariously simple how we do that. We connect via Zoom, and so we can see each other. So I can wave my arms around and they can too. But they record their voice on their voice recorder on their phone, and then they send us the file, and then we cut it all together. And,
really straightforward. That ability to see each other helps with the conversation, doesn't it? But then
some of them it certainly does. Yeah. You can see when somebody's busting to say something or when they want to interrupt, and that's helpful for us. But from a technical point of view, it's as basic as you get. But it does
simple unless somebody forgets to record.
No, well, that's awful. No, that hasn't happened yet. But it does mean, for example, you can get a speaker in the UK and one in Tahiti, both of whom have, everybody's recommended these people. Or when we did the illegal fishing, we had Ian Urbina, who was in Washington, and we had Daniel Pauly in Vancouver, me in France. So that's cool and fun to be able to connect like that and quick. But I think for TV, we have had the jump that happened after the pandemic that allowed us to be able to have video like we've got here. I made a program about what's happening in the Antarctic, and that was entirely post-produced with people who are either in the Antarctic or on their way back from the Antarctic or remote somewhere. But in that case, you've got to have decent pictures to illustrate it, because otherwise it just looks pretty cruddy. It just doesn't look good.
A good final tip. I'm conscious we've gone beyond half an hour. So Jeremy, massive thank you for your time today. I think some really, really useful insights that hopefully everybody watching has gratefully received. I'm not sure if we have any questions. If we do,
can I give you my quick thing I printed out that I want to show everybody? Check out this. Can you see that? This is, since pre-industrial levels, warming globally. We're at 1.22 degrees now. In Europe, we're at 2.2 degrees already. In the Arctic, we're at 3 degrees. That's the figures we're at now. Everybody will be talking about the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement. Remember that in Europe, we're already at 2.2 degrees. In the Arctic's at 3. So, it's serious.
It's serious, it's happening. And I think, if we can help businesses which are genuinely making a positive difference, then great. And if we can inspire individuals to collectively do better, then there's no harm in that whatsoever. I think that's a good note to end on. Jeremy, thank you very much. I don't believe we've had any questions in. Thank you everybody for joining today. Really appreciate everyone's time. And massive thank you again, Jeremy.
Excellent.
We'll look out for your content from COP.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Lovely talking to you. All the best.
Cheers, mate. Thanks for your time. Bye-bye.
Thanks, bye-bye.